Can we be good without God? Can you be good without God? I'm willing to bet that you answered yes to that question. But the question isn't, can we be good without believing in God? Of course, you don't have to believe in God to be good. The question isn't, can we recognize right or wrong without recognizing that God exists? Of course, everyone can do that. The question isn't even, can we put together a system of ethics that doesn't refer to God? In fact, there seems to be no reason why you would need to refer to God in a system of ethics. The question is actually more subtle than that. The question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? And theistic philosophers have put together a little bit of an argument for this. And premise one goes, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two says that objective moral values and duties do exist. And premise three says that therefore, God exists. Now, if you're someone who's not sure what you think about God, I'm not expecting you to buy that argument, but what premises do you push back against? Do you think there's a way to ground objective moral values in maybe society or maybe evolution? Make the comment section a discussion on the things you push back against and the things you agree with. And if you want to go a little bit deeper in on the discussion, head on over to our YouTube channel. And if you're already here on our YouTube channel, run the intro. If you're new here on the channel, welcome along. My name is Chris, and we aim to create videos that inspire your curiosity about faith and life. So if that's something that connects with you, then why not hit the subscribe button so you never miss one of those videos. Now, the last couple of videos, we've been having a conversation around whether it's possible that God exists. And when you're done with this video, there's a playlist over here somewhere that will link you to all those videos that we've created. Before we get into the actual premises of this argument, known as the moral argument for the existence of God, I did want to make two important distinctions that I kind of highlighted at the top of the video, and that's the distinction between moral values and moral duties. Moral values have to do with whether something is good or bad, whereas moral duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Chris, aren't good and right or bad and wrong, aren't they really the same thing? But there is an important distinction between the two. Duty has to do with obligation, whether you ought to do something or whether you ought not to do something. And there's a distinction, right? Because it would be a good thing for you to become a doctor or a lawyer or a filmmaker or a stay-at-home parent or a farmer, right? But there is no obligation for you to do those things. You can choose whether you do any of them, which means that good and bad have to do with something's worth, whereas right and wrong have to do with something's obligation. The second distinction I want to make is between objective and subjective, especially as it pertains to moral values and duties. If something is objective, it is independent of people's opinions. Whether it is, it means it's independent of people's opinions, but if it is subjective, it means it's based on people's opinions. So when we talk about objective moral values and duties, what we're saying is that there are things that are right and wrong, good and bad to do, regardless of what other people think of them. They will always be right and wrong, and they'll always be good and bad. So, with those distinctions made, let's jump into the conversation. Premise one is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. So do we need God for objective moral values and duties? Well, let's assume for a second that God doesn't exist and that the morals we have are just a byproduct of evolution or social conditioning. Given a different set of evolutionary principles or a different set of social conditions, we could have a completely different set of morals. In fact, Charles Darwin, in his work, The Descent of Man, points this out when he writes, if men reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can be hardly a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us as humans to think that we are somehow different by being human beings, that would mean that we're to fall into the trap of speciesism, which is to elevate our own species above other species in the animal kingdom. What about objective moral duties? Do they require God? Well, let's think about the animal kingdom. If a lion kills a zebra, it kills a zebra, but it doesn't murder a zebra. And on the naturalistic worldview, this would mean that certain actions like murder or rape or torture are really just not socially advantageous. Effectively just kind of like burping really loudly at the dinner table. It's not that they're wrong, it's just that they're not super socially acceptable. That brings us to our second premise, that objective moral values and duties exist. Now, not all people, but the vast majority of people would agree that acts like rape, child abuse, and torture are not just socially unacceptable, they're actually morally reprehensible. And that's because our moral experience says that there are things that are objectively right and wrong and good and bad. If you're still unsure what you think about this, just think of the Hindu practice of suti, where widows are burned on the funeral pyres of their husbands, the ancient Chinese practice where women are crippled as their feet are tied together in an attempt to resemble a lotus blossom, or how the Catholic Church covered up the abuse of little children by priests. You'd have to be hard-pressed to find someone who, when confronted with atrocities like this, still says that moral values and duties are just subjective and people can choose to do whatever they want, whenever they want. So where does that leave us? If premise 1 and 2 are true, it leads to the conclusion that therefore God exists. Now, it's been my experience that this argument or this idea for the existence of God generates the most conversation, simply because it's one that we bump up against every single day in terms of morality and ethics, whereas some of the other arguments like the existence of the universe or the fine-tuning of the universe, we don't really bump up against as often. So let's continue the conversation in the comments below. What questions does it bring up to you? What things would you like clarified? Or what are you curious about when it comes to this conversation? I thank you so much for watching the video. If there's someone's name that comes to mind that you think this video would be helpful for them, share it with them. And while you're at it, before you share, like and subscribe as well. You know the deal.